The command line is a strange thing to non-programmers. I've seen stranger things. I haven't seen the show. Blender offers command line flags that can be used to customize the Blender experience and even allow you to have multiple configurations set at once. So I wanted to share some ways I use Blender command line arguments that are not for rendering. This is sort of a spin-off to my video that I made a while back on rendering from the command line. It's not a requirement to watch it first, but rendering the command line does save a lot on memory usage and sometimes a little bit on render times too. So still worth checking out. We'll watch that one after. Watch this one first. But let me just share my favorite command line arguments for Blender. So let me just go into the Blender folder and let me create a shortcut for our examples. So we're going to be making a shortcut and we'll do example shortcut here. But by far, my favorite one is the factory startup. Blender actually comes with a lot of different presets, and so you can actually just do it from here. So I'm going to just do Blender factory startup, and this just tells you like, hey, we're doing factory settings. We'll add some logs. So that way, if you're reporting an issue to Blender, it'll give you those logs. And so you see it starts with factory startup settings. So I'm going to make this resolution scale bigger just for you guys. Or for the online extensions, it still asks me for offline or online access. And while I have all of my add-ons that I installed from the Blender extensions platform, it doesn't have any of my personal ones. So if I do NView, it's not there. But yeah, so it starts Blender with factory default settings. Now, why would you want to do this? The benefit of this would be of troubleshooting bugs, as Blender clearly stated with the opening. And let me actually let's just open this up. So you can just open in a notepad. It's just plain text. And you can see it has the factory startup flag. And of course, Python expression, which we'll get into as well. But I find this really useful when working with tutorials. All I have to do is, with my shortcut, go into the target for Windows, --factory-startup. I can ensure that there's no extra add-ons, there's no change themes or anything. So for example, maybe you make a lot of changes to your theme. Maybe you work in light mode. Maybe you use the genuinely disgusting extension theme that's publicly available. And maybe you don't want that to get in the way of when you make your tutorials. And especially when you're making tutorials for like absolute beginners or at least general Blender beginners, it's good to kind of just work off of the factory startup. Now, you don't have to work in the factory startup. All you have to do is just add that flag, and then you can run that shortcut whenever you're making your tutorials. Factory startup is also really good when working with add-ons, because when you're developing add-ons, you want a clean environment. You don't want your personal settings or personal add-ons to be affecting your add-on by accident while you're testing it. Speaking of add-ons, this next command line argument can affect those as well. And that is the online mode and offline mode. Now, for example, when you go into your extensions tab, especially on factory startup, you'll have this option of choosing to work in offline or in online. Now, usually with online access, all it's really affecting is the automatic update of add-on extensions and whether said add-on extensions can connect to the internet for their own purposes. But maybe you're in an environment where you don't want that online access. Maybe you're doing something with parental control or something like that, and you just want to be able to force it of only working offline, don't try to connect to the internet. And to do that, all you have to do is go to your properties on here. So just do --offline mode. So I do that, let's run it. Of course, the resolution scale is still low. I'm going to show how you can change that later as well. If I go to the extensions, you'll notice there is no option to online access because we launched it in offline mode and it cannot be changed. That's one of the nice things with some of these flags is that it's not just choosing the setting, which you can change whenever. You can kind of hard code that setting as part of this as well. So you can ensure that people by default can't try to access the internet with it. Next, let's go to graphics with the GPU backend. Now, if you're not familiar, Blender recently supported Vulkan. Just to give a general summary, OpenGL is kind of the grandfather graphics library. Just about every device is familiar with OpenGL and supports it. Vulkan is kind of the Gen Z graphics library. It's a little bit hip. It's kind of just the newer graphics library that supports a lot of newer graphics features that Blender wants to build off of, but it isn't as backwards compatible. But if you notice, if you try switching to it, you have to restart Blender, which can be kind of annoying. So instead of having to change it each time and then restart it each time, and instead you can just bake it into your startup. We go back to our shortcut. I know all the Linux people are like, why are you using Windows?
Because I want to.
I'm wanting to transition off Windows eventually. I'm taking my time. I'm transitioning. So here you do --GPU Backend. And then you can choose between OpenGL, Vulkan, or Metal for Apple devices. So we'll do Vulkan, and it's just all lowercase when you do it. So we'll do that. Press OK. Up our resolution again, just for you viewers. You'll notice that it says restart Blender is required, but that's because the factory default sets this setting to OpenGL, but that doesn't mean it's actually being used. Because when you go to Vulkan, you'll see it doesn't have that notification to restart. So this is Blender saying that it is set to Vulkan. But I've been using Vulkan for the past at least 6 months or so, and I really haven't had any issues with it. But having the shortcut is useful, so that way if you want to test Vulkan for certain cases, maybe just for specific geometry nodes or rendering or things like that, you can test and check with Vulkan without having to commit to Vulkan. I've also found this useful when testing my add-ons because OpenGL and Vulkan will work differently when drawing the UI, at least with add-on UI. So with my Color Picker Pro, which adds a little color picker in the 3D view, or with Light Painter, which I draw on top of the mesh, it does work a little bit differently. And so being able to see how they work differently and being able to test for them is really useful. And then next, run Python scripts. Now, before your artist run away, you can keep this as simple or as complex as you want. So for example, we've been using resolution scale to change the resolution scale each time we start up, but maybe we want to set it as part of our startup, so that way we don't have to change it every time in the preferences, such as for tutorials. So I could just change this to 3.0, make it even bigger. So let's try that. We'll do --python-expr, short for expression. Then use quotes, fill in everything. So we'll just set it to the 3.0. And now this actually doesn't import anything for you, so you do have to throw import BPY at the beginning with a semicolon. And so with that, let's click that again. Oh my goodness, it's 3.0. This would be like great for tablet stuff. Not that I'm using tablet. And if there was any errors with it, then it would just show up in the terminal here. This is great. So that way you can be able to change these settings to whatever you want within Python script. So you can use the Python expression, which you just do the expression in line, or you can have it point to a Python file, which is what I use for my tutorials. So I have this big folder of all my different presets, and I have presets for my tutorial script. So for example, with this, and so with here, I have options of enabling add-ons, setting the GPU settings and the UI scale on top of the factory startup. So that way I don't have to set it every time, it's just built in. And lastly, auto execution. I know I've talked about this in a previous video on Blender safety, but in short, scripts in your files can run automatically. If I scroll to it, when you open a script, you can set it to register, which means it'll run automatically upon loading the file. And this is great when setting up rigging interfaces or other scripts that you just want to run as part of your Blender file. However, you don't want to do this when you're working with unfamiliar files from people you may or may not trust online. And so, of course, you can set this in your preferences. Man, this 3.0 is fun to navigate through. And so you can set it in your save and load of enabling or disabling, but you could also force enable or disable with the command line. In this case, you do --disable -auto exec, or you could have it enable for the files that you do trust that you have rigging setups or whatnot. But I'll do disable auto exec. If I run that again, but yeah, you can still change it here either way. But the idea is that it forces it off even if you had it set on previously. I'll leave the link to the documentation in the description, so if you want to learn all the other command line options, you can look there too. There's actually an add-ons option where you can list all the add-ons you want enabled. I was actually going to go over that, but apparently it currently doesn't work. It'll technically enable the add-ons, but it just won't fully load them in a way that it works. So if I added the add camera rigs by Wayne Dixon from CG Cookie, but if I did this, for example, let me just show you how it works, just so that way when it does get fixed, you know how to do it. Add-ons. So I added that module path, and you just use commas if you wanted to add more, so you just do that. You notice I can still add like a crane rig, but you can see that it doesn't really work because some of the things don't get fully loaded. But once that gets fixed, The idea is then you could enable add-ons per shortcut, which is great. So that way you could have a rigging one, you could have a animating one, you could have a lighting one, and just have different add-ons for each one. Now the answer of why don't you just have all the add-ons enabled? Well, maybe you should check your Blender startup time. That is actually one of the main differences with as you add more and more add-ons, all those add-ons get loaded on startup, which means your startup gets severely delayed. Now, it may not be Maya startup time, but it'll still be a long startup time. So the great thing with this is that you don't even have to have the add-ons enabled by default. You can just have it configured to enable those add-ons just for that session, which can be very useful. But the point of all of this is that it lets you configure several different shortcuts. So maybe you can have a tutorial Blender, and this could have your factory startup. And then you could have a working with other people's files Blender. That way you could disable auto exec and maybe factory startup, so that way nothing else gets affected. Whatever the use case, once you get comfortable with Blender, find ways to automate your workflow. I'm not talking about trying to just get every shortcut possible to streamline everything. The end goal is to do whatever you want to do with Blender. So instead of having to just change settings back and forth, you can configure them into these shortcuts. So happy configuring, happy automating, happy Thanksgiving to the Americans, including me, and happy blending.